Hi, I'm Baldur, and this is the Conducting Coaching Podcast, where we talk about conducting from the inside.
Hello and welcome back. This week I'm here in Spain on tour in Castilla y León and we play Beethoven 7, so I thought, why not make a podcast about Beethoven? Beethoven is sort of this uber figure in orchestral music and also in conductors' repertoire. He was responsible in many ways that many orchestras started out because after his death there was just a continuous demand for his symphonies to be played again and again, and that's why many European orchestras in that time became established. Not just did he discover new musical territory, but he also touched a nerve of his own time, especially actually after his death. And so he became something like the prototype of an artist, a prototype of a composer as we know it. He became nearly synonymous with what we call classical music. He lived at a time where music really took center stage in the public consciousness. And a lot of that started in Germany, German idealism, writers like Kant and Schopenhauer, who talked about the importance of especially instrumental music, who was seen as having higher spiritual aspirations than vocal music. In that moment in history, together with a wider demand for access to culture, access to concerts, education from the new middle classes, that's where Beethoven's music arrived. This was a historic and social shift that started before Beethoven arrived, but his music fell exactly into that place, and because of the way his music was seen and interpreted, he became sort of this uber composer, this sort of central figure to the artistic movement at the beginning of the 19th century. His music was seen as sometimes dealing with philosophical questions and especially representing the spirit and the aspirations of his own time. This may be something we could learn from nowadays. But this was down to, in its time, also to people like E.T.A. Hoffmann, who, for good or bad, had a big influence on how Beethoven's music was seen after his death. Now, equally as important as for the development of the modern orchestra, Beethoven was partly responsible for conducting becoming a profession. On one hand, because of this explosion of orchestral activity in the 19th century, but also because his music was seen as the sort of measurement of the quality and the importance of a conductor. Many historic writers write about interpretation of Beethoven, for us maybe most famously Richard Wagner in his book about conducting, but also Furtwängler, Weingartner, many famous conductors who wrote books about conducting or about interpretation. For all of them, Beethoven's music is the center of the repertoire and in a certain way the measurement of a conductor. Beethoven marked also a shift in the way musical texts were seen. Before his time, scores were like more maybe general recipes for a performance. And from Beethoven onwards, musical texts were seen as like holy scriptures that were analyzed, disseminated, and discussed in endless detail. Now, the wealth of documentation and information about Beethoven, about his life and his work, and also about the history of interpreting Beethoven's work, make it sometimes very difficult for a young conductor to find himself within these endless possibilities of approaching Beethoven's music. When I look at applications, of course, many people send Beethoven symphonies, or you see videos of young conductors and so on. And you see everything. You see the influence of John Eliot Gardiner, you see Carlos Kleiber, you see the influence of Toscanini, you see the influences of Simon Rattle. And it feels like every possible thing has been done already. And it's difficult to find, in a way, your personal voice in that. And then there are also the orchestras. The orchestras are influenced too. They have their traditions, or they have their way, how they learned to approach Beethoven in their own education. Every musician has that, and the orchestras in themselves have traditions that come sometimes from their music directors or from just a certain way of playing Beethoven. And all that together just throws up the question, what can I do with this great music that is original, that is mine, and that is not secondhand? Now what I want to do here is I want to go through some questions that I think you have to answer to yourselves when you approach Beethoven. Things you have to clarify and that you have to decide in your own mind and with your own musical approach before you stand in front of an orchestra and do a Beethoven symphony. I'm not going to talk about what is right or wrong because, the history of conducting, conducting books in the past and so on is full of people saying, look, you have to do it that way and that's the only way to do this and this. You have to take these decisions for yourselves. The more information you can get, the better, obviously, to construct your interpretations. But there's a few basic questions that you have to find your own answers to. The first question would be, will you approach Beethoven in a historically informed style or not? And if you do, to what sort of degree will you go into historic performance practice? Nowadays, many orchestras are completely used to playing Beethoven in many different ways, and that includes historic performance practice. So there will be no trouble playing a symphony with no vibrato or with more articulations on the string and so on. In some places, people will even be able to use historic instruments, at least for some of the sections. For example, brass players sometimes can play on natural instruments if you ask for that with time. But they can also play Beethoven with 14 first violins, with lots of vibrato and so on in a really romantic approach. Now, when I started out, I usually said things at the beginning. I would just say, okay, let's do it with no vibrato. The Keile don't always mean short, and just a few basic things about the style or what I had in mind. But nowadays, I take a slightly different approach. I don't say these things at the beginning. I just pick out a few musical spots where I just explain what sort of musical idea or what sort of sound I have in mind, what sort of phrasing I have in mind. And from there, I let the orchestra get to the right technical decisions on how to do this. Sometimes I say, look, we need a simplicity here that maybe implies not playing vibrato. And then from there, just bit by bit, the people get a drift of what your idea is, and they will adjust things technically in their own way. My own approach is definitely influenced by historic performance, but I learned over the years that you can achieve the same musical results in very different ways. So nowadays, maybe I take a bit more a musical approach than a purely technical approach. And as we talk about historic performance practice, and if that's part of your interpretation, you have to think how far to go. What sort of instruments you use. Will you add the brass notes, for example, that the natural instruments couldn't play? Will you let the flute lines just go to top A? Or, for example, does it make sense that maybe an orchestra plays on Baroque timpani or on natural brass instruments, but everybody else plays on modern instruments and so on? These are all questions that you for yourselves have to decide. And then there is also the issue of how to transmit this to the orchestra. How do you transmit certain playing techniques, certain approaches? And there, I think it's always better to go from a musical image, especially if you're at the start, you maybe don't have so much experience. Say what you have in mind. Find characters, find ways that ignite the imagination of the players and that allow them to understand what sort of musical approach you want to take. The next question you have to look at is the editions you will use. Nowadays, of course, most orchestras will play with urtext, some sort of an urtext edition. Nobody plays from the old, early 20th century editions anymore, or most people don't. But within the urtext editions, there are really major differences sometimes. I did a class about this some time ago, and we looked at Beethoven 4 and the difference between a Breitkopf and Bärenreiter editions, and it was extreme, the kind of differences you saw. And this is because, of course, in Beethoven many things are ambiguous, and you have even a musicologist has to take certain decisions. But what I would always prefer is an edition that makes this all clear and leaves the decision to me. So it lays out all the facts, and all the discrepancies in a score, and gives me the possibility to decide what makes sense for me and what not. Now, some urtext editions are very thorough and very well researched, but they take the decisions for you. I much prefer an edition that lays all the evidence out, the good critical commentary, or even in the score or the parts, says what the possibilities are, because sometimes there are differences in different sources and so on. There's a space of decision that you have to be able to use as an interpreter. And I think these editions in a way are the most practical, because they show you what's there and then you can take your decisions based on the evidence. And all this is great, but of course you have to make sure that the orchestra uses the same edition as you do, because otherwise you get into an endless process of correcting minute details without ever having the chance to get to the music. Then another thing you have to be clear about is if you go with metronome markings or not. Now, metronome markings, of course, this was a big discussion for a long time. René Leibowitz in the 60s, I think it was the first one to record all the Beethoven symphonies in the metronome markings. I think this is a great recording. And it just showed that, it's all possible, because sometimes you hear the story that this is not really possible, it's just too extreme and so on. It's all perfectly possible. The question is, do you go down that route or you don't? As you know, the Beethoven metronome markings, they came later into the score, when he was already deaf. And so there's lots of questioning. When I was young, there was even the theory that we should play everything twice as slow, because back in that time, people would take 2 metronome ticks as one beat. It's just to show that all sorts of theories are around. But nothing can substitute for your own study and insight. You can study with as many teachers as you want and so on, but fundamentally you have to sit down with this music and live with it, read about it, let it marinate, look at the other works of Beethoven, and just bit by bit build up that interpretation that is really right for yourselves. Then you have to decide about string sizes and about orchestral layout. Will you play with separate violins? Where do you put the basses and so on? This will also, of course, depend on the hall, but it's part of your conception of a piece, of course. And Beethoven, again, can be done in many ways, but this is something you have to decide. And then string sizes. Even in Beethoven's time, his pieces were performed with really varying string sizes, and sometimes really large, sometimes really small. So again, this can be done in many ways, but you have to be clear that a string size doesn't affect just the balance or the dynamics, but it affects, for example, articulation. It sometimes affects the tempo, how you can play certain things. So if you do something with 14, 12, 10, 8, 6, or 8, 6, 4, 3, 2, makes a big difference in your whole approach to a piece. And it's important to clarify this beforehand. Sometimes it even gives an orchestra a drift of what sort of approach you will take. So all these small decisions, they help you that people understand quicker what you have in mind. Then the last point is, how do you read Beethoven's musical texts? For example, the Keile he writes, some people say this means short, some people means it just means not slurred. Then there are discrepancies in various parts, sometimes there are short sort of notation where an articulation is just notated at the beginning of a phrase, but should it go on after that or not? What do you do with slurs on repeated notes? And then there are all the string issues, how close you want to get to the original notation with all its inconsistencies and so on. These are just a few of the aspects you will have to look at when you do Beethoven. Obviously, it's impossible not to be influenced by tradition, but you have to decide for yourselves what sort of traditions make sense and what don't, because some of them came into use just by pure habit and others are really reflected and documented and so on. And also about the conducting, of course, it's impossible not to be influenced by people you see, but the only way to get to your own approach to Beethoven, your own relationship to Beethoven, is with the musical text, with the score in front, and with your own research. That's the only way you can find your own voice, your creativity, and your inspiration in approaching this great music.
Thanks for listening. To send us your comments or suggestions, please write us a message on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with all the conducting coaching news and events.